Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Vincent Herrera. I'm from Heat Press Nation, and today we have Jimmy Lamb joining us. How are you doing today, Jimmy?
Hey, I'm doing great, Vincent. I understand you just came back from vacation, so we hope you're doing good as well.
No, definitely had a blast, but I'm definitely excited. This is going to be part 3 of our 5-part series, and definitely looking forward to what you have for us today.
Okay, great. Well, I am ready to go, and as Vincent just said, we're doing a 5-part series about starting a sublimation business. This is number 3, where we're going to look at how to select the right sublimation heat press. Now, I got to tell you before we get started, I mean, Heat Press Nation, I don't think there's a heat press out there that they don't carry, but I could be wrong. But I'm telling you, they have a fantastic selection of heat presses, all kinds of shapes, styles, different models. So they're a great resource for finding the right press for your sublimation business. Now, what I'm going to be focusing on is not so much telling you this press is better than that press, but really explaining to you the needs of sublimation in regards to the heat press, because sublimation, being a chemistry process, is very dependent on the heat press, okay? And it does not tolerate inaccurate temperatures and pressures, etc. So with sublimation, you really want to look at the better presses, okay, the more reliable, the higher end presses, just because they're more of an industrial grade that we need for sublimation. So we're going to talk about all that as we go to kind of explain here what's on my mind. All right, so with that said, the sublimation printer. Now, by far, we talked about that last week, okay, in part 2 of our series. The printer is your most important piece of the puzzle, but the second most important piece is the heat press. And there's all kinds of heat presses out there. If you go out and start going through the websites and internet and you're trying to figure it out, you're probably going to get a bit overwhelmed, to be honest. So there's certain key things that we want to look at with a heat press, and that's what we're going to talk about here. And quite luckily for you, Heat Press Nation has everything that you need, and they also have the expertise to help you out. So when you leave this particular session and you start shopping around, feel free to contact their experts and get some advice from them, because there are a lot of different things to look at, okay? All right, so let's start off by talking about the different styles of heat presses. The first is the clamshell press, which is the most common one that we see out there. And you can see with these 2 different presses how they're hinged basically at the back, and they open like jaws of an alligator. And, you know, I use alligator as a reference because where I live, we do have alligators, okay? So keep that part in mind. But anyway, that's how they work, kind of hinged at the back, open and close like a set of jaws, all right? The second is the Swingaway Press, and to me this is the most reliable press. With the Swingaway Press, the way it works is the top platen here actually lifts straight up when we open it. So when we open it, it comes straight up, and then the whole top half swings over to the side, exposing that lower platen for easy access. But it isn't just about easy access that I like with this Swingaway Press. I like the consistent pressure that it applies, because the 2 platens are always in parallel with each other. So when you close it down, it's just like kind of making a sandwich, to be honest. If you look back at this one, they're not in parallel with each other. So when it closes down, depending on the thickness of your item that you're pressing, you may end up having more pressure here than here on something that's very thick. And I'll show you more about that in just a moment. The third style is the drawer press. And this is probably the most versatile. This particular unit here has a double function. The drawer function is such that the upper platen lifts straight up, just like we saw with the Swingaway, but the bottom platen pulls out to expose the work area. But by the same token, the top half also swings open as well. So it's basically a Swingaway with a pull-out drawer. So there's a lot of versatility in that particular setup. And then we have wide format heat presses. So if you need to go into really big stuff, maybe you're looking at the VJ628 printer, for example, then you're going to have to look at a wide format heat press to be able to handle those larger items. Now, I'll tell you the other thing about a wide format heat press. It isn't just about doing large items. It's doing lots of small items. And that's one of the things when you start looking at what size heat press do I need, don't think just about what's the largest thing I need to do, but you might be somebody who actually has to do a whole lot of small pieces. For example, maybe you do a lot of coasters. I mean, I know people, their only business is coasters, but I mean, if you had to print and press 100 coasters, you go a lot faster if you had a big heat press than if you had a small heat press. Okay, so that's one of the things about the larger area is you get more volume production as well as larger size. Then we have a pneumatic heat press. So when you look at pneumatics, pneumatics use air pressure to open and close the platen. This particular one is a Swingaway. When it's swung back into position, you actually hit these two green buttons and it uses air pressure to close it down. Why do I call it the most precise? Is you can dial in a very specific pressure. And, you know, for example, with sublimation, the ideal pressure for most substrates is 40 psi. But if you don't have a way to measure 40 psi, you're just going to say, okay, medium pressure. I mean, that's our reference. But with this type of unit, you can get that kind of precision. We have cap presses out there for doing headwear. We have mug presses, and there's a lot of different mug press layouts there. That's pretty cool stuff. And if you go to their website at Heat Press Nation, you can check it out. But I like their 6-in-1, which gives you different capabilities for different size mugs as opposed to just a single size mug press. There are systems out in the marketplace where you use a wrap around a mug and then put it in a convection oven. So it's not a heat press at all. It's just a different methodology. And for somebody that has to do large volumes of mugs, if you have a large convection oven, think about, you know, the oven in your kitchen. Don't use that one, by the way. Sublimation is not hazardous as far as the fumes or the gas, okay? But you're going to get escaping gas into that oven, which may affect the taste of your food and maybe even the color, who knows. So you would use a separate convection oven. You wouldn't use the one in your oven. But the concept, again, is you're wrapping an item like a mug or even other items, rounded items, with larger wraps and putting them in there. So you have a lot of options of where you want to go with your heat press capabilities. But now let's start talking more about the behind-the-scenes aspect of a heat press so that you understand that what you're buying is of a better quality. As I've said before, with sublimation, the accuracy of the heat press is directly related to the quality of the image that you produce. And if you have an inferior heat press, you cannot fix that problem. You would have to replace the heat press. So the idea is you buy a heat press that's of good quality and will last a long, long time, so we don't have to worry about that aspect of what we're doing. Okay, common problems associated with heat pressing: improper image color, an uneven color across the face of the image, as well as ghosting, which means that parts of the image show up in the wrong place. And we can typically fix that problem with our production processes. But again, these are the kind of things that we're seeing when things go wrong with your heat pressing. And in some cases, you cannot fix the problem without replacing the heat press. Okay, so it's very important that we keep that part in mind. The key with sublimation: time, temperature, and pressure. For most products, but not all, for most products, it's 1 minute at 400 degrees Fahrenheit with a medium pressure. We really say it's 40 psi, but since most people cannot measure psi, we say medium pressure. Of course, the challenge with that is medium for me, I'm a pretty big guy, is not going to be the same as medium for my mother, okay, to put it bluntly. So that's where we have to play a little bit, okay, to get it right. Now, there are other products out there that use different settings. For example, if you're doing apparel, you're probably more in the range of 385 degrees for 35 to 40 seconds with an extremely light pressure. Okay, but I'm here to tell you that across the board, when you start changing your variables, you will see a difference in color. If you have a 10-degree difference in temperature, you can see a significant difference in color. So that's why we want to make sure that our heat press is consistently putting out the pressure and temperature is required. You know, the time we can always check because there's a timer on there. We can certainly double check that with a stopwatch. It's a little bit harder to verify proper temperature and pressure on a routine basis, but we'll try to address that as we go. So let's talk about pressure first. When we're doing the pressing, pressing is a very important aspect, the actual pressure part of sublimation. And we have to have even pressure. Uneven pressure will yield uneven imaging. That's a fairly easy phrase to remember. And even though we are, in most cases, we have a lower platen that does not heat, and then we have an upper platen that does, and the upper closes down on the lower, there's still pressure being exerted upwards as well as downwards when we close it down and tighten that heat press in the closed position. So we need to make sure that it's very consistent. If there was more pressure, let's say, and why would we have more pressure in one area than another? One reason could be a warped heat platen. And you'll see that on some of the lower cost units. Over time, the metal can warp, which may not be a problem when you're doing things like heat transfers, like vinyl letters, because there you're just heating up adhesive. As long as the adhesive on the material melts, you're fine, okay? I mean, you need the pressure to push everything down together, right? But if you have a little bit of uneven pressure, usually it's not a big deal. But when you're talking about full color imaging done with sublimation, uneven pressure can make a difference in how the color looks. So that's why it's very important that we have that taken care of with our system. So a better quality heat press is typically built with a heavier platen, so therefore we have that consistent pressure forever, more or less, okay? Now, the other aspect of pressure, and this is why I'm a fan of the Swingaway and the drawer style, is the actual unit itself. Now, this is a bit of an exaggeration, but in reality in sublimation, we do work with some thicker products. You know, some of you may be apparel people and you're just thinking, oh, I'm putting a t-shirt in there, clamshell should be fine. And you're right, a clamshell will be just fine on a t-shirt and thinner products. But if you start looking at things like award plaques and some of the signage type of products, because a lot of times we use acrylic and glass for signage, but definitely those three items right there are all significantly thicker than the t-shirt. Flip-flops, for example, they're very thick as well. So when you have something, if you actually have it hinged back here and it's thick, when it closes down, it's not this dramatic, but you start to understand that I'm probably going to get more pressure here than I am there, which can affect my imaging. Whereas when I go with this type of setup, equal pressure works out great. Now, I do know that there are some more sophisticated levels of clamshells. There are some clamshells that have sort of like a double hinge where it starts closing down in this angled pattern, but then it will actually flatten out before it gets all the way down. So I'm not saying a clamshell is bad. Please don't misquote me on that. If I'm going to do sublimation, and I know if I'm going to do sublimation, I want to be as versatile as I can be, then I'm always going to lean towards the Swingaway because I understand I can do thicker products very successfully. So that's why I believe in that. Yes, Swingaway will cost more, but you're investing in a business, and if you can't produce what people want, and you're trying to save a few bucks by buying the cheaper press, then you're not doing yourself any good. So keep that part in mind. I'll tell you, a good quality heat press, and Vincent and the staff here at Heat Press Nation can tell you all about warranties and service and all that, but a good quality heat press is going to last you a long time. We'll have a good warranty. We'll have a good service team behind it. You'll be able to get parts. You'll be able to make repairs if needed. But, I know people that are using brands that are 20 years old, and they have absolutely no problem with it at all because they bought a really good press. And if they have had any issues, they've been able to pick up the phone and get somebody to help them out. So, yeah, they paid a little bit more money for it up front, but in the long term, it's more than paid for itself. And that's the key. All these things are going to pay for themselves pretty quick. I mean, when you start looking at heat presses that run, say, $1,500 to $2,100, that sounds like a lot of money when you're writing a check, but the reality is when you start producing things, it doesn't take long to pay for that. Not at all, okay? And then you know that you have something that's going to be there with you, okay? All right, so let's look at the temperature aspect. Here's something else we have to be very careful of because better quality heat presses have better quality heating systems. And we need to make sure that it's an equal temperature across the platen. Just because you have a number that's displayed on the control panel doesn't mean that it's 400 degrees everywhere. okay? You know, they didn't put a probe everywhere. They have a probe somewhere in here, and maybe they have a couple that average it, but they have a probe somewhere that's measuring that 400 and reading out to that indicator. As long as it's all in calibration, it's telling you what's going on. But is that everywhere across the surface? So, or is it like 390 degrees over here and 400 degrees there? Well, if that was the case, you would see the difference in the color. So when you start talking about better built heat presses, there are better built heating systems in them. And the different manufacturers use some different processes, but I think that Heat Press Nation can tell you more about those types of manufactured elements, okay? All right, so I want to make sure that I got 400 degrees across this entire surface, and that means looking at towards, you know, the better unit. Now, here's another thing to keep in mind. When you open the heat press, you let out a lot of heat, right? So the heat press has to cycle periodically to maintain that 400 degrees. And there's nothing, you're going to see that with any heat press. You're going to see it cycling through the temperature. It should be a very small range of cycling. If it's cycling 20 degrees, you got a problem, okay? So it should be a small range. But when you have it open, certainly you have room temperature blowing against that 400, trying to cool it. So you want to make sure it can maintain the heat, that you don't have to wait for it to warm back up for 10 minutes between pressing. That just wouldn't make any sense. So we do have to take that into account. How fast does it cycle back up? Okay, so we can maintain that setting when we close it. And yes, it's possible that once we close it, again, you're transferring heat out of the heat platen into the product that's being pressed, and you may actually see it drift down just a little bit. The key here is if it's drifting down consistently across the whole, you know, platen, you probably shouldn't see any discolorization issues, okay? And you shouldn't see it drift down very much anyway, if it's a good quality press. All right, but here's something else I want you to think about when we're looking at this. Think about the outer edges right here. The outer edge of the platen, what's over here? Room temperature air, okay? So the room temperature air, even when it's closed, is right here. So we have heat that's being pulled out of the heat press just by simple physics around the edges. And so I'm a little bit careful about that. And this is my rule of thumb. This is not from a manufacturer. This is not from Heat Press Nation. This is my rule of thumb, okay? When I look at that platen, let's say that I'm looking straight at the platen itself, the surface, I realize that most likely it's going to be a few degrees cooler along the edges, just because of the fact, again, that we have all that room temperature air around it. That's a whole lot cooler than that 400 degrees. So it's going to be a little cooler on the edge. The question is, how far does that effect extend inward? Okay, in other words, is there a very small area of the edge that may be a few degrees cooler, or is it a very large portion of the edge? Okay, well, there's nothing published anywhere on that. What I have found, and I'm a very conservative person, and again, these are my numbers, I've found with the better quality presses, my assumption is that I have this 1-inch border where the temperature is starting to fall off. If it's only falling off, you know, 4 or 5 degrees, 6 maybe, that's not a big deal. It's not really going to hurt you. But when you get to that 10-degree drop, that's when you definitely see a lot of discolorization, okay? And what I mean by that is it usually looks a little lighter in color than the adjacent color. So from my references, when I'm shopping a press, you always want a press that's larger than the largest image you can print for sublimation. Simple as that. Larger press than the largest image you can print. I look at a 16 by 20, which is probably the most popular size for sublimation, 16 by 20, as having an effective pressing area of 14 by 18. That's just me being conservative. I don't know if or how much it might drop off on the edges, but I just want to know that, you know, the largest image that I feel really, really comfortable putting in here is probably a 14 by 18. Well, let's think about that. If you buy the SG800 we talked about last week, the largest paper you can run through it is 13 by 19 if you have the bypass tray. You cannot print to the edges. You lose about 1/4 of an inch on each edge, so it's really about 12.5 by 18.5. It'll be maximum image, maybe even a little bit less. That would work. Okay, so that 16 by 20, it's a good safe number for the SG800 and definitely the SG400 too. I mean, think bigger. Even if you're buying a smaller sublimation heat press right now, I guarantee if you buy a small one now, you're going to be getting a bigger one later. I can guarantee it. No need to have to buy another heat press too. Okay, so for me, my recommendation for most people starting out is a 16 by 20 as a minimum size press. They do make bigger ones. Okay, you go into say a 20 by 24 or something like that. You can't print that large with your SG400 or SG800, but you can do that multiple piece production. And if you buy a VJ628, you definitely have a 24-inch wide image that you can produce. So you got to think about having a press slightly wider than that. Okay, so those are the kinds of things you think about. Now, I've also found, too, that some of the lower quality heat presses, that turns into about a 2-inch border, okay, because they save money by reducing the heating elements within there. So that's just a good rule of thumb. As a good quality one, that's just me being conservative. You may go measure it and find out there's very little temperature drop on the edge. It's just me being conservative, but I would think that way because you never know what you're going to print down the road. How do you measure? Because you should check periodically on a heat press. A digital pyrometer is a device that can be used to help make temperature readings on the platen. So you can routinely take multiple readings to get an idea how consistent your temperature is. This is actual, some of the heat press manufacturers sell this. This is one that George Knight sells, and the George Knight or Geo Knight press is one that Heat Press Nation carries. But this is one of the products here that they recommend for checking that temperature. And that way you know that you're within those boundaries. It is possible. It is possible in some of these heat presses for your indicator to be slightly out of calibration with your heating element. So this is another way we can kind of test that periodically. Okay, but if you bought a good quality unit, you're not going to see that happen anytime soon. All right, so we're going to wrap it up. There wasn't a whole lot here to cover, but I think I emphasized my points, and my points being, about buying the right thing. We got to have that consistent time and temperature. Okay, I can't emphasize that enough. So real quick, think about these things, okay? The heat press will be the most expensive piece of startup equipment that you purchase. It really will be. Don't focus on price, focus on quality, reliability, and dependability. And always with everything that you buy in your business, listen, this is a guy that's bought a lot of equipment over the years. Trust me. Don't focus on price. Focus, again, on quality, reliability, and dependability. Just what I said before, but I wanted to repeat that. And then think long-term. Okay, I know everybody's on a tight budget. You're trying to get into this. I mean, people tell me all the time, hey, I want to get into it cheaply, and then if it works out, I'll buy more stuff. Well, a lot of times they buy too cheap, and it never works out. So if you bought good quality equipment, let me tell you something. If you bought good quality equipment, you decide the business is not right for you, you should be able to resell it and get some pretty good money. Certain names of heat presses out there have great resale value because they have great quality. So you can turn around and move it pretty much what you bought it for, if you need to, okay? Warranties, easy access to technical support, very important. You may need more than one type of press. Most of the products we do are flat, but if you're going to do mugs, you got to think about a mug press too. So you may want to buy them together as a package. Heat press might give you a little deal on that. I don't know. And then final thing, as I've said a few minutes ago, your flat press should always be slightly larger than the printed image, okay? Keep that part in mind. Now, I saw something else here I wanted to show you real quick while I have your attention here, and that is just taking a quick look at the Heat Press Nation website, okay? If you go to the Heat Press Nation website, you'll see that they have everything you can imagine in here. So you got a good resource of just getting in here and starting to shop. And then if you actually go in, like for example, I was looking at the 16 by 20 presses because 16 by 20 most popular size for sublimation. But on this particular web page, and you can find it on the other web pages too. Look, they got a buyer's guide. They have a sublimation heat press video. A heat press video. Heat Press 101 tutorial for heat presses in general, to explain heat presses to you. So these guys got lots of great resources, plus you can just pick up the phone and call them, okay? And they'll help you out with that. So keep all those things in mind, okay? These things just going to make this whole process easier. Okay, so that pretty much covers what I wanted to cover. And Vincent, are you still there?
I'm still here, Jimmy. Thank you so much for all that great information. Definitely explaining the differences between the heat presses, is extremely important. And, for any of our listeners or anyone that's going to be watching this video in the future, please feel free to give us a call at any time to speak to one of our experts. we have tons of information that we can give to make sure you're getting the right product. Just give us a call at any time at 800-215-0894. And lastly, for all our listeners right now, do check your email because we will be sending out a coupon codes within the next 24 hours or so. Check the newsletter or give us a call for any more information on that. But what a great webinar, Jimmy. You're doing a great job.
Thanks, Vincent. So next week we're going to be in well, actually we're skipping next week because there's a holiday next week. The week after is when we'll come back with part 4, and that's when we're going to talk about sublimation graphics, okay, some of your graphic options. So you want to make sure you tune in for that one as well.
All right, Jimmy. Thank you very much, Jimmy, and you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Vincent. You too. Everyone else, thanks for coming, and we'll see you next time.